All right, this is going to be part 2 of your ecology video notes for this theme. So to start these notes, we're going to focus on community ecology and population dynamics. So first, properties of a community. So there's 5 major things that are properties of a community that we look for. First of all, diversity. So 2 components here, species richness, which is the total number of species, and then the relative abundance, which is the number of each species that is present. The second thing is vegetation. So which plants are there and how are they distributed? Are there taller trees? Are there shrubs along the outside? Are there ground cover plants inside on the bottom of the forest? How is everything distributed? Next is stability, and that's just simply the ability to resist change. If there's something introduced or something changes in the community, what is the stability of that community? Fourth is the trophic structure. So what are the feeding relationships and how does energy move up the food chain? And finally, those limiting factors that we discussed in the first video, abiotic and biotic factors, and it's also the range of tolerance. How much of a difference can those organisms survive? So the first thing we're going to discuss here then is ecological succession. So this is the change when a new community is formed due to a change in biotic and abiotic factors. And we're talking about plant growth here. So there's 2 types, primary and secondary. First is primary. This is the gradual growth of an ecosystem where there has never been one before. AKA, we're starting from bare rock. So after bare rock, you have lichens and moss that grow, and they eventually form some sort of soil substrate for other plants to start growing. Then you're going to get small annual plants, then perennial herbs and grasses, then you start getting your grasses and your shrubs and some of your trees that are shade tolerant, and then finally you get your major trees. These are things like oak trees are here, your hardwood trees. In secondary succession, there used to be an ecosystem, but it's been destroyed, whether that's a weather event, a forest fire, sometimes it's even things that's left alone, such as an abandoned farm field that's left to grow and eventually it becomes a climax community. So once again, we start with our pioneer species, but notice that we're not starting from rock. There's already soil in this ecosystem. From there, you have your grasses and your perennials, your shrub, pines, young oak, hickory, and then those mature oak trees and hickory trees that form that climax community. So when we look at primary versus secondary, they are almost the same. The species go in the same order in terms of how they inhabit the area. The only difference is primary starts with that exposed rock, and secondary is starting after a disturbance, a fire or flood, or even something like an abandoned farm field. They both end in a climax community though, and this is the final stage of succession, although it's seldom reached just due to changes in environments in general. There's also limiting factors that contribute to populations and ecosystems, and those limiting factors can be abiotic or biotic. So these are things that are going to restrict the numbers of individuals, their reproduction ability, or even their distribution. Things like sunlight, climate, temperature, amount of water, amount of nutrients, whether there's fires or not, soil chemistry, space available to live, and many other living things. Now there are 2 categories of limiting factors, density independent factors and density dependent factors. Density independent factors simply are factors that does not depend on the number of animals in a population. So a weather event, for example, a tornado isn't going to pick the forest that has the most animals living in it and touch down there. That doesn't happen. It just is at random, and whether it wipes out a bunch of animals or not very many is all dependent on where it happens. This is also things like forest fires and even humans altering landscapes. So lots of development issues are density independent factors. Density dependent factors then do depend on the number of members in a population. So a lot of times this is things like competition, these are plant life, animal life, but it's also disease. So obviously the more species, the more animals you have living in an area, the more likely there is to be a disease that spreads quickly. Same thing with parasites, those are going to spread quickly as well. So when we're comparing dependent versus independent factors, remember that the density dependent factors depend on the population or the density of that population. Density independent factors are at random and they don't depend on population numbers. So when we look at the population density in general, it's simply just the number of organisms per unit. So this graph here shows hare and lynx, so hare is a type of rabbit. So it shows the populations going up and down, and you can see as the prey population goes up, the predator population goes up too, but then they also both decrease. Spatial distribution is simply just the pattern or spacing of a population. So this, once again, it can be random, it can be even, or it can be clumped. So this graph shows the population change in humans in the United States, but it does show that random distribution. So there's clumps of people in certain locations, and then there's also just randomly all throughout the country. When we talk about population growth rate, there's some important terms that we need to know. So first of all, population growth rate itself, or PGR, is how fast a given population grows. Zero population growth, then, is when the birth rate equals the death rate. So the birth rate is simply the rate of birth in a population, and the death rate is the rate of death in a population. There's also two types of growth models that we're going to look at. So first of all, your exponential growth model. This is when the growth rate is proportional to the size of the population. It just keeps going up and up and up and up, like you see here. The logistic growth model, on the other hand, is exponential growth until a limiting factor slows down that population growth. So it's going to slow or stop, the growth will, following something reaching a carrying capacity. So whenever you see carrying capacity, this is referring to a logistic growth model. Then simply put, the carrying capacity is just the maximum number of individuals in a species that the environment can support long-term, being the key component there. It's limited by things like amount of energy available, amount of water, amount of oxygen, and the nutrients that are available in that environment. And it's also really common, if you look back at the previous graph, it shows us just kind of going and hitting. This graph is a more accurate representation of a carrying capacity. So there's usually going to be an overshoot, which you see here, and then there's a die-off, and then it just kind of keeps going up and down right around that carrying capacity. There's also two types of strategists that you need to know. So the R strategist is adapted to living in unstable environments. This is known as the rate strategy. They're generally a small organism, they have a short lifespan, and they produce many offspring. So if you look here at this rat, you'll see they have lots of babies. Now when rats are pregnant, they're not pregnant for months at a time. They're pregnant for a very short amount of time, and they have lots of offspring, and then they get pregnant again very quickly after that. K strategists, on the other hand, are adapted to living in stable environments, and this is the carrying capacity strategy. So these are generally larger organisms, they have a long lifespan, and they produce few offspring. So if you look at the elephant here, elephants are pregnant for over a year before they have babies, and even then they just have one baby at a time. The final thing we're going to discuss in this unit is human impact. So a big topic is human population growth. So will the population grow forever? Do we even have a carrying capacity? So if you look here at this graph, what kind of growth model is this? This is not logistic. We have not reached a carrying capacity. This is an exponential growth model, and it's continuing to grow. Something ironic that's also increasing is the carbon dioxide and the temperature. So as the temperature has increased, the global temperature, so has the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. A coincidence? I think not. These are very closely related, and this is a huge component in global warming and our impact on the Earth. So when we talk about world population growth, there's a few reasons why our population has grown so fast. First of all, we have things like agriculture. We have domesticated animals, we have machines, we plant mass quantities of crops for production. So the agriculture has really contributed to us being able to support a larger population. In addition, there's medical advancements, things like sewer systems, medicine, antibiotics. These are things that people that lived hundreds of years ago didn't have access to, so they had a much shorter lifespan. And finally, the Industrial Revolution. So this has made things easier. People aren't working so hard. There's machines that will do the work, which is also contributing to longer lifespans. And we'll watch this human overpopulation simulator in class. There's some other issues we have with humans. So there's things like invasive species, animal captivity, poaching, and species extinction. Of course, the one everyone knows about, pollution, global warming, the greenhouse effect, all kind of lumped together. deforestation, biomagnification, and eutrophication. So these are two things that we're going to talk about in a little more detail as well. So here's just kind of some examples. So these are zebra mussels, which are invasive species. It also shows this is the Burmese pythons, which are also invasive. They've been pets and they've been released into the wild, and now they're killing native wildlife. If you look at this graph here, it shows species extinction versus human population. So as our human population has grown, so has the number of species extinctions. Some other things here, this is an algae bloom in a lake. We have lots of litter, deforestation, and pollution, and then of course the picture of the polar bear on the melting ice cap to represent global warming. So the greenhouse effect is something that you may be familiar with, and it's related to global warming. So this is just when the excess amounts of toxic gases that we release, mostly carbon dioxide, are released into the atmosphere from multiple sources. So if you look at this picture down here, it shows some sources. There's engines, there's burning of trees after deforestation, there's greenhouse gases being emitted from factories. All of these things are contributing to the greenhouse effect, which means there's a large barrier around the planet which is trapping heat into the Earth's atmosphere. So this is causing the climate overall to become warmer, causing a feeling of being in a greenhouse, which is why it's called the greenhouse effect. So if you look here, there's a natural greenhouse effect, which is good for us. But then there's the human enhanced one. So there's less heat escaping into space, and it's all being trapped around the planet. So the two terms you need to know then are biomagnification. So biomagnification, first of all, is the movement of toxic substances up the food chain. And in this situation, the top carnivores have the most toxins. So if you look here, these red dots represent the amount of mercury in each of these animals. So if you look, the biggest animals, so the fish, the otter, the bird, the human, those are your top carnivores, are the ones that are eating the most. And the issue is this little fish is eating this plant, which has a little bit, and then the big fish is eating the plant. But then look, what are we fishing for? We're fishing for the big fish, right? You don't keep the little ones. So the larger fish you eat, the more toxins they have in their body because they've accumulated them all along the way. And the final term we're going to talk about is eutrophication. So this is the excess buildup of nitrogen and phosphates, which is a result of humans impacting the nitrogen and the phosphorus cycle. It's then being run off into the water from pollution or just simply from deforestation, causing the land to not have that protective barrier between the water. And this results in algae blooms. So those algae blooms block the amount of oxygen that flows to the bottom waters, and then you get lots of death on all those bottom dwellers, all those fish. They float to the surface and they're dead, so they're just floating in the water. And then not to mention the algae itself blooms and then dies, so that has a very strong odor as well. So eutrophication can be a really big problem. And that is all for your notes.